A power substation outside Bandar Bushehr went dark this week, and it sat that way for roughly 2 hours, because it took a direct hit from an American strike a stone's throw from Iran's only operating nuclear power plant. That happened on the 11th consecutive night of CENTCOM strikes against Iran, and it landed within hours of one of the most explicit escalation threats President Trump has issued in this entire war. Understanding why that specific substation, in that specific location, matters more than the raw strike count from any single night requires working through the full sequence of what triggered it, what Trump actually said afterward, and what it reveals about a regime that's simultaneously absorbing sustained military degradation and still finding the institutional bandwidth to execute its own citizens. Start with the message Trump sent. He posted on Truth Social that from this point forward, any time Iran shoots at a ship in the Strait of Hormuz, whether by missile, rocket, drone, or any other device or weapon, the United States will bomb and destroy one bridge or power plant, including those located next to or inside the capital city of Tehran. That's the exact quote, not a paraphrase, and it's worth being precise about why naming Tehran specifically changes the character of this threat. Every prior American strike in this renewed phase of the war had concentrated on coastal and maritime military infrastructure, radar sites, command centers, drone storage, fast attack boats, the physical architecture Iran uses to threaten shipping. This policy explicitly extends the target list to the capital itself, the one place where nearly everyone still nominally running Iran's government has concentrated since February. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bakr Kalibaf, President Masoud Pezeshkian, and the various institutional voices that serve as public mouthpieces for both the IRGC and the Supreme Leader's office. Unconfirmed reports have circulated suggesting Iran's actual Supreme Leader may have left the country, and his son and named successor, Mojtaba Khamenei, has maintained an unusually low public profile throughout this war, with some reporting suggesting his own movements may include leaving as well. None of that is independently confirmed, and it's worth treating those specific claims as reported rumor rather than settled fact. What's not in question is that threatening Tehran directly represents a deliberate, calculated form of pressure aimed at the psychological and political center of Iran's leadership, not just its coastal warfighting capability. Iran's response arrived within hours through its own state-linked channels. A senior Iranian official told the semi-official Tasnim news agency that if American forces target an Iranian bridge or power plant, Iran will respond by striking infrastructure and bridges across the region, including energy facilities in which the United States has interests, adding that after the preceding 10 days, Washington should already be convinced that Iran strikes wherever it decides to strike, and that any such gamble by Trump would once again end in what the official called his embarrassment. That's language that reads as much like an attempt to project confidence for a domestic Iranian audience as it does a credible warning to Washington. Separately, and more specifically, Brigadier General Sayed Majid Musavi, commander of the IRGC's aerospace force, threatened that if the U.S. bombs Iranian bridges and power plants, there will be power outages in other countries in the region hosting American troops. That's worth parsing carefully, rather than treating as equivalent bluster, because it isn't simply mirroring Trump's language back at him. It's a threat aimed specifically at the civilian electrical grids of third countries, Gulf states hosting U.S. forces, in retaliation for strikes on Iran's own infrastructure, meaning it would place the exact category of civilian harm Iran objects to, when applied to its own territory, onto the populations of its neighbors instead. Before going deeper into the current strike sequence, the human cost driving all of this deserves to be stated plainly, because it's easy to lose track of amid nightly strike footage. Iran's health ministry reported that U.S. strikes have killed at least 53 people since fighting resumed on July 6th, with Tasnim separately reporting close to 600 people injured over that same window. Iranian media has also reported sharply rising food prices as a direct consequence of the war's economic disruption. On the American side, 3 U.S. service members recently killed in this conflict had their remains received by President Trump at Dover Air Force Base, an event he described before departing for the ceremony as one of the hardest things to do as president. A rare moment of unscripted candor from an administration whose public messaging has otherwise leaned heavily on confidence and escalatory resolve. It's also worth noting, since it complicates the simple narrative that Americans broadly support continuing this war, that while Trump said publicly this week that Americans aren't against the war, available polling suggests otherwise, with support for the conflict's continuation notably weaker than the administration's own framing implies. Now, the immediate sequence. Roughly 14 hours before the Bushehr substation strike, Iran made unmistakably clear that the ceasefire framework was over in everything but name. Drones and missiles were aimed at U.S. and allied positions in Kuwait, Bahrain, and Jordan, alongside another attack on a vessel transiting the Strait of Hormuz, adding to a toll of mariners already killed or wounded by Iranian strikes on commercial shipping throughout this war. Kuwait's own military confirmed in real time that its air defenses were actively engaging hostile missile and drone attacks, according to a statement reported by the New Arab, the kind of routine, almost procedural public confirmation that reflects how normalized this specific pattern of nightly cross-border fire has become. Jordan's air defenses intercepted 8 of 10 incoming projectiles, 6 missiles, and 4 drones, with the 2 that got through landing in open ground without damage or casualties. Bahrain's Interior Ministry reported sirens sounding for a second time as Iranian drones targeted the country's air navigation systems specifically, though air traffic wasn't affected, a detail suggesting deliberate probing of aviation-adjacent infrastructure rather than indiscriminate firing. CENTCOM answered all of that the same night with its 11th consecutive evening of strikes, releasing footage of FA-18s launching from a carrier deck at night, striking exposed rocket stockpiles, and destroying what appeared to be a mobile radar and command vehicle, exactly the kind of platform that lets Iran reposition and threaten shipping from a moving location rather than a fixed, easily targeted site. Reporting throughout this war has described Chinese satellite firms providing geospatial targeting data to the IRGC, and a mobile launch platform benefiting from externally supplied coordinates would represent a genuinely harder tracking problem than a fixed installation, even as CENTCOM's persistent surveillance has clearly been finding and eliminating a meaningful number of these systems regardless. The target list that night, per CENTCOM's own description, prioritized military operations centers, maritime strike capability, and aircraft and drone storage facilities, with the Bushehr area substation folded into that broader package rather than singled out as a standalone target. Iranian sources separately reported strikes and fires near the Kubar range and in the Bebahan area the same night. Restoration crews reportedly had power back near Bushehr within hours, but the message was unmistakable regardless of how quickly the lights came back on. This marked the second time a transformer unit outside Iran's only operating nuclear plant has been struck in this campaign, a repetition signaling deliberate, sustained pressure on that specific facility rather than incidental targeting. And it landed just days after CENTCOM released footage of an underground Iranian drone storage facility that was burning by the following morning. Every additional category struck in this campaign, coastal radar, command centers, drone storage, now a power substation adjacent to a nuclear facility, sends the same signal. Once Iran keeps striking commercial shipping, everything stays on the table, and Trump's retaliation policy has now extended explicitly to strikes on American forces themselves, with the president stating he's instructed Secretary of War Pete Hegseth to respond 20 times as hard if U.S. forces are targeted or suffer casualties. On the platforms flying these missions, it's worth being precise about confirmed fact versus reasonable technical inference. The FA-18E, the single-seat Super Hornet variant, and the FA-18F, its two-seat variant with a weapons systems officer in back, have been running nighttime carrier operations throughout this stretch. There's also a genuinely interesting emerging capability worth understanding on its own terms, even though its presence in this specific theater isn't confirmed by any official source: Shield AI's X-Bat platform, a collaborative combat aircraft built around what the company describes as hive mind autonomy software, designed to operate in contested, GPS-degraded, or electronically denied environments without constant human control, precisely the kind of jamming-heavy electronic warfare environment Iran has been trying to create in the Gulf. The concept behind manned-unmanned teaming is straightforward. A Super Hornet crew functions as mission commander, while an X-Bat, or a flight of them, pushes into the most contested airspace first, running strike, reconnaissance, or electronic warfare, while the human-crewed aircraft holds back at a safer standoff range. Shield AI has priced the platform around $27 million a unit, a fraction of an $80 million F-18 or $100 million F-15E, cheap enough that commanders can risk it on missions nobody wants to risk a manned aircraft on. Whether X-Bat is actually flying in the Gulf right now isn't confirmed, and that distinction matters. What can be said is that this is the exact environment the program was designed for, and if it isn't already there, the Gulf represents close to the ideal proving ground for this kind of teaming once it deploys. Now for the Kuwait invasion threat specifically, because it deserves grounded analysis rather than repetition of the rhetoric driving headlines. Iranian officials have pushed past denial into open threats against Kuwait directly, with reporting describing threats of a full-scale ground push and the seizure of American personnel stationed there. It's worth naming the geography that constrains any actual execution. Iran shares no land border with Kuwait at all. Any real ground option would have to route through southern Iraq, a maneuver American ISR assets would almost certainly detect well before it became an actual crossing. Footage has circulated showing tanks and equipment moving toward the Iraqi border region adjacent to Kuwait, and it would be a mistake to dismiss that activity outright. But the American counter is already built into the map. Roughly 13,500 or more American personnel are already based in Kuwait, concentrated in facilities Iran has named as potential targets, backed by air power and ground-launched precision missile systems, capable of engaging any Iranian armored column crossing open desert terrain long before it reaches populated Kuwaiti territory. A defensive posture built well in advance of this week's rhetoric, rather than assembled hastily in response to it. Iranian officials understand that any real ground incursion would almost certainly become Iran's most catastrophic military and propaganda defeat of the entire war if American forces respond as decisively as their current posture suggests. That gap between the volume of the rhetoric and its actual operational feasibility is itself informative. This looks less like a genuine military plan and more like psychological pressure aimed at forcing Gulf states and Washington to divert attention toward defending against a scenario Iran's own geography makes extraordinarily difficult to execute. It's worth pausing on something happening inside Iran during this exact window that reveals more about the regime than any missile count could. While absorbing 11 consecutive nights of strikes, with its own nuclear-adjacent infrastructure being hit and its coastal military capability being systematically degraded, Iran still found the institutional capacity to carry out executions tied to protests that erupted back in January, well before this current war began. Iranian state television, through Army spokesperson Brigadier General Mohammad Akhantnia, confirmed this directly. Reports describe an 18-year-old and a 23-year-old executed following a mass trial in which 12 defendants collectively received a single hour of court time to present their positions, a structure that leaves little room to interpret the outcome as anything other than predetermined. A government absorbing sustained degradation to its actual war-fighting infrastructure, simultaneously prioritizing the resources needed to carry out politically motivated executions of its own young citizens, is not a minor side note. It's a direct window into what this regime treats as non-negotiable, even under maximum external pressure, protecting its grip on domestic dissent, even as its capacity to project power abroad keeps shrinking night after night. That combination, a government executing its own protesters while failing to prevent sustained degradation of its coastal and nuclear-adjacent infrastructure, is not the posture of a government negotiating from strength, regardless of how loud its rhetoric about Kuwait or regional infrastructure gets. It's the posture of a government focused on protecting its own core seat of power, which is exactly why threatening bridges and power plants inside Tehran itself represents such a pointed signal rather than simply an extension of the existing target list. It helps to place this 11-night sequence inside the fuller arc of the war. This conflict began February 28, 2026, when Israel, working with American intelligence, killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in a coordinated strike, triggering Iran's initial closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the naval blockade the U.S. imposed weeks later. An April ceasefire and a June memorandum of understanding brought roughly 3 weeks of relative calm before Iran's renewed attacks on shipping collapsed that framework. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking during meetings in Manila the same week, said plainly that Iran doesn't currently seem serious about making a deal, noting Tehran had made commitments in last month's memorandum and violated them within 2 weeks. That's a direct, on-record assessment from America's chief diplomat, establishing that the diplomatic track isn't merely stalled, but actively judged non-functional by the administration's own senior leadership. Iran and Oman, which also borders the strait, had issued a joint statement back on June 23rd, insisting that all arrangements related to the strait must fully respect the sovereignty of both coastal states, language that in hindsight reads as groundwork for exactly the unilateral closure and shipping attacks that followed. Trump had separately confirmed just the day before this specific escalation that the United States plans to strike Iran's underground nuclear facility at Pickaxe Mountain, roughly 120 miles south of Tehran, telling reporters the site would be hit probably pretty soon and very heavily. That threat sits directly alongside the bridge and power plant policy driving this update, together representing the two most significant escalatory threats Trump has made public in a single week since this renewed phase began. There's a domestic political dimension worth folding in as well, because it shapes how much runway Trump actually has to keep expanding the target list. Both chambers of Congress, controlled by Trump's own Republican Party, passed war powers resolutions back in June directing the president to end hostilities with Iran, a largely symbolic but historically rare bipartisan rebuke. Combined with the polling gap described earlier, a policy explicitly committing the United States to striking targets inside the national capital every time Iran fires on a ship represents a genuinely significant escalatory commitment made against real domestic skepticism, even from within the president's own party. It's worth going deeper into Iran's actual leadership structure because it explains why threatening Tehran carries the specific weight it does. Multiple independent assessments describe Mojtaba Khamenei's operational role since being installed as supreme leader as largely ceremonial, legitimizing decisions made elsewhere rather than directing policy himself. with real authority concentrated around IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi and a narrowing circle built around Iran's Supreme National Security Council. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has continued handling diplomatic messaging, while Kalibaf, himself a former IRGC commander, has increasingly functioned as connective tissue between Iran's political, security, and clerical establishments. That structure, a wounded and largely symbolic supreme leader, a hardline guard commander holding actual authority, and two relatively more pragmatic officials with limited independent power to bind the harder-line security apparatus, is precisely why threatening the capital functions as such targeted pressure. It's the physical location where nearly every remaining piece of that fractured decision-making apparatus is currently concentrated. Israel's own posture continues sitting just outside the specific exchange, watching and preparing without formally rejoining direct combat. Israeli officials have said repeatedly in recent weeks that the IDF remains alert and prepared to resume independent strikes on Iran for a third time if called on to, warning any renewed involvement would come with even greater force than either previous round this year. A week, including both a direct American threat to strike inside Tehran and confirmation that Pickaxe Mountain will be struck soon, is exactly the kind of development likely to keep that Israeli calculation active, particularly given how directly any strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure intersects with what Israel has treated as a core national security priority throughout this conflict. Away from the Gulf entirely, a genuinely unsettling security scare unfolded much closer to home this same week, worth including because it illustrates how directly this war's psychological weight has reached into everyday life, far from the actual conflict zone. Air traffic control at LaGuardia Airport issued a man-pads alert just after midnight, following a Port Authority police report of a man reportedly carrying a portable rocket launcher near Terminal C. Incoming flights, including a Delta flight arriving from Detroit, were told to use extreme caution on final approach, with air traffic control audio capturing pilots asking directly what a man-pad is, a man-portable air defense system capable of targeting aircraft during the vulnerable low-altitude phase of takeoff or landing. Authorities investigated quickly and determined the threat wasn't credible, and operations continued without incident. It's worth noting how rare an alert like this actually is. The only closely comparable recent precedent is an alert at Los Angeles International Airport back in 2013, also ultimately non-credible. Nothing in available reporting confirms any actual connection between this specific incident and the broader Iran conflict. But it's a reminder of how thin the margin for error becomes, and how seriously even an unconfirmed report has to be treated once a country is in an active, extended shooting war with a state actor possessing this exact weapons category in its own arsenal. It's worth briefly addressing an idea circulating in commentary around this same week, that sustained military pressure could eventually create space for an internal Iranian insurgency to take hold and grow, potentially, with outside support. That's worth treating as informed speculation about a possible long-term consequence rather than a stated American policy objective. There's no confirmed indication that seeding or supporting an armed domestic insurgency is an actual declared element of current U.S. strategy. And history offers a genuinely mixed record on whether external military pressure reliably produces internal uprising versus simply hardening a population's dependence on, or fear of, the security apparatus doing the repressing. Iran's western border already offers a real, closer precedent worth learning from directly. Iranian Kurdish opposition groups based in Iraq have continued a low-level armed campaign against Tehran for months, absorbing real, repeated retaliation without managing to meaningfully destabilize the regime's national grip, even after Washington briefly and publicly floated, then withdrew direct support for exactly that kind of uprising back in March. That's the closest available real-world precedent for what a foreign-encouraged Iranian insurgency actually looks like under this war's conditions, a considerably more modest and contained outcome than the kind of rapid internal collapse speculative framing sometimes implies. Before getting into the platforms themselves, it's worth naming the broader pattern in how this campaign has evolved night by night, because the sequence is deliberate rather than random. Coastal radar and surveillance infrastructure came first, degrading Iran's ability to see and track shipping. Command and communications nodes followed, disrupting the coordination that turns individual sensors and weapons into a synchronized response. Drone and missile storage facilities came next, working through the physical inventory Iran would need to sustain any renewed offensive. And now, power infrastructure adjacent to a nuclear facility, paired with an explicit policy extending strikes into the capital itself. Each phase has built on the reduced defensive capability the previous phase created, a logical escalating sequence rather than an improvised response to whatever happened to be convenient. It's worth being fair to the broader strategic read. This week's developments actually separate from the more dramatic framing of any single threat. Iran's stated public objective throughout this war has been control over passage through the Strait and sanctions relief. What its actual behavior this week suggests it wants, more immediately, is a way to project strength domestically while its actual position at sea keeps deteriorating. Executions and inflammatory state media rhetoric climbing at precisely the moment Iran's military capability is being reduced, night after night, is not a coincidence. It's the observable signature of a government using domestic repression and external bravado as substitutes for battlefield success it currently cannot achieve. There's a genuine structural risk worth naming as this escalation unfolds, one that cuts against easy predictions in either direction. Trump's new policy, one bridge or power plant destroyed for every Iranian strike on shipping, is designed as an automatic, predictable deterrent, meant to make the cost of continued Iranian aggression mechanically certain rather than dependent on case-by-case decision-making. But automatic, tit-for-tat policies carry their own risk precisely because they remove judgment and proportionality from each individual response. If Iran fires a single drone that causes no damage, and America responds by destroying a bridge or power facility inside Tehran regardless of the provocation's scale, that policy could produce a faster escalation spiral just as easily as effective deterrence, especially applied against a leadership structure this fragmented, where an individual IRGC commander's decision to fire on a single ship may not reflect a considered judgment by Iran's broader political leadership at all. A policy built to punish the state uniformly for actions taken by its least centrally controlled military branch risks striking Tehran's civilian infrastructure and remaining political leadership in response to decisions that leadership may not have fully sanctioned in the first place. Whether that combination, automatic escalation on one side, a government substituting repression and bravado for battlefield success on the other, eventually pushes Iran's fractured leadership toward genuine negotiation, or instead produces exactly the kind of unpredictable, high-risk spiral a cornered government under this much simultaneous pressure sometimes reaches for, remains the single most important open question hanging over whatever comes after this 11th night of strikes. Trump's new policy and Iran's own threats against Kuwait and regional infrastructure haven't answered that question yet. They've simply raised the stakes for whichever answer eventually arrives, and raised them specifically around the one city where nearly everyone still nominally running Iran's government currently resides, waiting to see whether the next Iranian shot fired at a commercial vessel becomes the one that finally brings American bombs into the capital itself.